If you get the AWOS here, AWOS there, maybe one in the middle, and that's your weather briefing, please take the time to work on your weather briefing skills. Hey there, welcome back to AeroSafe, the General Aviation Weather Channel. Today is Sunday, March 3rd, 12:36 p.m. Eastern or 17:36 Zulu time. Today we're going to walk through our weather briefing using the AeroSafe Weather Brief Checklist. If you're interested in how to get a copy of this checklist, you can look at this video here. If you feel like your weather briefings are lacking a little bit of substance or a little bit of information that enables you to make the best decisions possible in regards to weather, then maybe this AeroSafe Weather Brief Checklist is something that you would be interested in using, in addition to watching these weather brief videos that I do. Interestingly, originally when I started this channel, the idea was that go through this information and it would help you make a more informed go or no-go decision based on current weather conditions. I found that actually these weather briefings actually are more educational. So they're learning how to do an in-depth weather briefing, how to look at all these products available, and how to make the best decision possible and really get a grasp on and understand what's going on in the weather in their area. So here on AeroSafe, on these aviation weather briefings, we're looking at the big picture. We start with the surface analysis and the weather patterns and the weather systems that exist. So high pressures and low pressures and cold fronts and warm fronts. And then we look at things that matter to us as pilots: ceilings, visibility, turbulence, wind, icing conditions, all of those things that matter to us as pilots that go into our decision making and our understanding of hazards as they exist. As I continue making these videos, I see people that comment regularly, and it's really fun to establish that connection and relationship and chat with you guys. If you're using this weather brief checklist for an actual flight, then you would want to start on this first page with the 91103 items. So get your flight plan together with your destination and departure, get your weight and balance, do your fuel requirements, alternates, NOTAMs, traffic delays, runway lengths, weather reports, and forecasts. And that's the piece that people really struggle with, is the weather reports and forecasts. The FAA leaves it pretty vague. What I've seen is a lot of pilots, student pilots and certificated pilots alike, when they do a weather briefing, especially VFR, they'll look at the AWOS where they are, the AWOS where they're going, and the TAFs for those as well. And then they make their go or no-go decision based off of that. Maybe if they're going quite a distance, they'll look at a METAR in between. And that's a problem. That is a very primitive way of doing a weather briefing. And while it hits some big points, you're missing a lot in the en route structure. If that sounds like you, if you get the AWOS here, AWOS there, maybe one in the middle, and that's your weather briefing, please take the time to work on your weather briefing skills. It will save your life one day, I promise you. That being said, we're going to start, as we always do, with the surface analysis. And this shows us our pressure systems, high pressures and low pressures, and it shows us our frontal systems as well. Big thing that's going on with our surface analysis right now is this low pressure and spider web that's existing over the Dakotas and the West and Midwest. Off of the East Coast, we've seen this front move away, cold, warm, and then stationary. And then we've got a warm frontalysis. So frontalysis means that the front is diminishing in strength. Okay, we got some lows and highs over the Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado area. At least some stationary fronts in the west. Quite a few troughs, some highs and lows. A lot of mix of things going on. The big story, though, that's very interesting to me is this low pressure with the fronts extending from it. Interesting that the fronts seem to be kind of swooping. Isn't that interesting? As usual, mix of pressure systems, mix of frontal systems. All right, we're here on 1-800-Weather Brief. Next thing we're going to do is go over to our interactive map. We're going to turn on the layers for the METARs and the TAFs. This will help us determine areas of VFR weather, areas of IFR weather, and then once we do that, we'll get a little bit more into the nuts and guts and figure out what hazards may exist within those areas. This line of marginal VFR and IFR weather, Virginia down to the tip of Texas, kind of a mix in there of marginal IFR and some VFR areas as well. Oh, and some low IFR as well. Far northeast, we have IFR and low IFR. Bangor, Maine, special observation, 1 mile of visibility. There's rain, mist, overcast at 400. And it looks like it's gonna kind of persist in bad weather. Let's look back at our surface analysis and see if we can discern what's causing that. So it looks like that nasty stuff in Maine is being caused by the backside of that low pressure and the trough. A trough is an area of elongated low pressure. Low pressure is rising air. Air is lifted, it gets cooled to its dew point, and we get some fog. And we know that that air is pretty darn saturated because if we look at the temperature dew point spread, there's only 1 degree of difference. Temperature is 10 degrees Celsius, dew point is 9 degrees Celsius, which is why we've got low ceilings and low visibility. A mix of nasty stuff all along the Great Lakes here. So some of it's back into the low pressure, some of it is this mixture of fronts here probably. But because it is relatively high pressure in there, my guess is that it's going to be pretty stable. So there's a pi rep here over Hancock. Tops of the clouds are at 3,000. There is no icing and bases are below 400 AGL. If the tops of the clouds are at 3,000, bases are really low, what that's telling us is that there's not a whole lot of vertical development. There's not a whole lot of lifting action, which makes sense when we compare that to the surface analysis chart and see that over there in Michigan, we're somewhere between 1027, which is pretty high pressure, and 989. 1019 in that area, that's still pretty high pressure. Up over North Dakota here, we see lots of marginal IFR and low IFR. Rugby Municipal. Ooh, very windy. 070 at 20, gust 26. 8 miles visibility, overcast at 400. Temperature dew point spread, I don't know her. Altimeter 2927. Holy moly, that is really low. The main low pressure here, and then we've also got some troughs extending from that. That low pressure is creating that lifting action. Remember, low pressure means rising air. So we've got lifting action that's creating a lot of that nasty stuff. From about South Dakota down to northern central Texas, it looks pretty clear. Low pressure over the panhandle of Oklahoma. So let's see if there's any wind going on there. If we look at Amarillo, holy moly, 27031, gusting 42, a result of those low pressures and troughs. While that is VFR, and it's very VFR, I am curious to see when we turn on the air mets if we're going to see a sustained surface winds air met. South Idaho, Pocatello, that is IFR. We've got light winds, 020 at 6 knots, half mile visibility, RVR between 2,400 and 3,500 feet. There's snow, freezing fog. Stay away from there, and it's going to get worse as a result of that low pressure, lifting air. Northwest Washington, we've got marginal stuff. Seattle, a few at 1,000, overcast 1,600, winds at 12 knots, 8 miles visibility, and rain. 3 degrees. Generally speaking, we got a mixed bag today. VFR, Southern California up through towards Pennsylvania. IFR areas in the southeast, in the Dakotas, along the Great Lakes, in the far northeast, and then along the western coast, we've also got some IFR weather going on. Kind of a mixed bag here. However, as we already saw, there are some hazards associated in all of these areas. We will now turn on air mets. In a lot of those areas that we talked about being IFR, we've got air met Zulus as well. Air met Zulu means there are freezing, icing conditions. We have visible moisture, so clouds or precipitation, and a temperature around freezing or below. Here in the northeast, freezing levels between 4,000 and 9,000. Moderate icing between the freezing level and flight level 190. So you're not going to be able to get above it. And you're really not going to be able to fly below it safely because there is some pretty high terrain up in there. The coast of Georgia and South Carolina, moderate icing between 11,000 and flight level 240. Potentially could fly under that as long as there aren't other hazards. Along Colorado and Utah, moderate icing below flight level 210. Freezing level ranges from the surface to 13,000. How many of those areas do we have ceiling? Even the stations that are VFR, the stations are filled in. They are solid green circles, meaning that there is a ceiling somewhere. Aspen, they're overcast at 4,800, and you are not getting out of Aspen without experiencing icing because of how low that ceiling is. You cannot remain below the freezing level, above terrain, and out of the clouds. Pretty low ceilings when you combine that with air met Zulu. Far northwest, yeah, moderate icing below 140. Moderate icing between the freezing level and 140. Freezing levels between the surface and 4,000. And then up here, this one, it's freezing on the surface already. We know that. Moderate icing between freezing level and flight level 180. If we turn off the Zulu, we'll turn on the Sierra, and this supports everything we were talking about earlier with the IFR versus VFR. Red air mets are the air met Sierra because you cannot see. Ceiling below 1,000 and visibility less than 3 miles. The purple ones are specifically for mountain obscuration, meaning that we have instrument conditions and mountains. If you cannot see a mountain, you're going to have a hard time avoiding it. Flying in instrument conditions is already filled with its own hazards and risks. And then you add to it mountains that you can't see, and you could potentially get yourself in a very big pickle known as a controlled flight into terrain accident, and not a lot of people walk away from those. IFR and mountain obscuration over a whole lot of the west as well, which makes sense because we talked about that being IFR earlier, and then along the northern border of the country as well. So Montana over through the Great Lakes, we've got IFR air mets. If you lived in these areas, you would want to look closely at, are my personal minimums intact here in terms of ceiling and visibility? Do those personal minimums align with my current level of proficiency and currency? Are my personal minimums met throughout my route of flight? And are conditions deteriorating or improving? Now we'll turn on the air met tangos, T for turbulence. Now this encompasses high level turbulence, so over flight level 180, which doesn't necessarily apply to us as piston pilots, but it does give us an idea of how things are moving in the atmosphere overall. It also includes low level turbulence, so below flight level 180, and low level wind shear, and sustained surface winds greater than 30 knots. Green air mets are for high level turbulence, and we've got a whole lot stretching over southern Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, all the way up to California, Oregon, then up and all the way over to Wisconsin. Yellow air met tangos for low level turbulence. Moderate turbulence below 8,000 in this area. Over here, moderate turbulence below flight level 180. Probably come from the rising air, the difference in these pressure systems, the air is going to be moving, and the mountains in that area. We also, though, have low level wind shear over the Four Corners and the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas. As we talked about, we saw really strong winds there. Here we go. Here's the sustained surface winds. Surface winds greater than 30 knots expected. So we do have an air met for high sustained surface winds in that area that we looked at, where we saw a peak wind of, what was it, 46 knots. We also have low level wind shear up here by the Great Lakes. So you might end up in a position where on short final, you've got airspeed changes of 20 to 30 knots. In light piston airplanes, that could potentially put you below the stall speed, no longer flying. Neither of these are situations that I would want to fly in with low level wind shear. All right, we've looked at surface analysis. We've looked at our air mets. Let's look and see if there are any SIGMETs present. Ooh, yay! I love it when there's SIGMETs. Not because I'm excited about bad weather, but because it's something interesting to look at. Mountain wave, occasional severe turbulence below flight level 250, reported by a citation. And high level turbulence, so same thing. And low level wind shear, strong low level winds, mountain wave. Let's see if we can find that PIREP. Wow, we got a couple of PIREPs that are urgent. Turbulence severe, PA27, a little Piper. The PIREPs support this SIGMET here. So we've got it all here too as well. We've got SIGMET for low level wind shear, low level turbulence, high level turbulence, mountain wave, golly bum, and an active convective SIGMET over North Dakota. Developing area of embedded thunderstorms moving from 160 at 35 knots. Tops are up to flight level 300. We're not going through that. We're not getting over it. Got some convective stuff down over Florida caused by this stationary and low pressure. We know, or should know, that there are a lot of hazards associated with thunderstorms. We've got microbursts, turbulence, icing, hail. Definitely stay out of all these convective SIGMET areas and think twice before I flew into one of the outlooks. PIREPs all over the place that are supporting ceilings, tops, turbulence, icing. PIREPs give you the most up-to-date information about what environmental conditions actually are present. Air mets and SIGMETs and freezing levels, those are based off of predictive models. They are only so good. And the more information that we give to other pilots and our meteorologists in the form of PIREPs, the better off we are. If there's an air met for turbulence and you get up there and there's nothing, make a PIREP. So PIREPs are useful for a multitude of reasons, and it's not just about us as pilots, but also about helping our meteorologists give us the best information possible. We'll hop over to aviationweather.gov for a couple of these freezing levels, and this level shows at the surface. We have a range of altitudes for the freezing level up here, also a range down there. Freezing level is pretty high through a lot of the country, which makes sense. As we move into March, things are starting to warm up. Okay, we also want to look at cloud coverage. So even though a lot of the IFR areas are kind of sketchy in terms of other hazards that also exist, the cloud coverage map is really good if you're going on an instrument flight or VFR even, and you want to see a bigger picture of where the clouds exist. So both the bottoms and the tops. This map is going to give you a really great idea of that. And this is of course based on predictive models, so it's not going to be 100% accurate. The tops are a great way to plan your cruise altitude. I don't know about you, I don't really like to cruise in instrument conditions, especially if there's no autopilot on board. If we look at the chart, we can see tops are actually not super high across a lot of the East Coast. 6,000 seems to be the highest until we get down into Florida where there's convective stuff going on, and the tops are 4,500. The northern border is a different story. Tops are pretty high as well, and also because of that convective stuff. Over in the west, tops are also super high, so you wouldn't be able to get above the weather there. We looked at freezing level. We'll look at winds aloft, 7,000 feet, 50 knots here from the southwest. You'd have to take that into account in terms of your time for each leg, of course your fuel burn, and then do you have the fuel to make it with your reserves? All right, we looked at METARs and TAFs. Last thing that we would want to do is look at our forecasts. Alrighty, if we look at our forecast for 24 hours from now, so it looks like that low pressure system that's kind of in the middle of the country right now will have actually moved north by tomorrow, taking with it some of that nasty weather. Now where the dry line is in Texas, we're seeing a meeting of that dry air and moist air, and we're getting some stuff there as a result, some weather, some precipitation, some rain with a chance of thunderstorms. The northwest, lots of low pressure there, lots of rising air. It's going to bring lots of precipitation, and it looks like it's going to be mostly in the form of snow, but also a chance for some thunderstorm off the coast. Looking at the low-level significant weather chart, we see a lot of this reflected in our categorical reports. So we've got IFR in red, and then outside of that with the little clouds is going to be marginal VFR. Tomorrow on the East Coast is going to be either IFR or marginal VFR, and Texas up to Kentucky pretty similar. Great Lakes is going to be kind of gross as well. Freezing level on the surface area is going to grow, which means if you're north of that tomorrow and there's visible moisture, there's going to be icing conditions. And it looks like there's going to be quite a few areas where there is visible moisture up in the northwest and Four Corners area and Northern California up to Washington. Doesn't look like it's going to be a really great day tomorrow unless you're in Iowa or Missouri. The last bit of a weather briefing, a good solid weather briefing, is going to be calling 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF to talk to a real person. Ask some questions, get some new perspective ideas, see if there's anything you may have missed that you didn't pick up on. You can also call a CFI who you think will make it to be an old pilot. There are old pilots and there are bold pilots. Talk to a person, see if there's holes in your Swiss cheese that are lining up. Make good decisions. Thanks for tuning in and watching and contributing to aviation safety by being a part of the community. If you want access to this weather briefing checklist, you can look at it here. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, please feel free to reach out. I love to chat with you guys. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye.